You might be overwhelmed with death, and it might overwhelm you that your years are passing by so quickly. But let me say something that's far more formidable than the brevity of life, and it is the thought of God. That is the ultimate situation that lies before us. Hi, I'm Dr. John Neufeld. Welcome to Back to the Bible Canada. Thank you for joining me today. It's always delightful to take the time and spend time in Scripture, learning from Scripture, allowing Scripture to transform us. I've been speaking about, looking for God in the midst of trouble, and I can think of no better place to go than to Psalm 90, spend some time there, come to an understanding of what it means to face trouble in our own lives. And here I'm talking about the trouble of the brevity of our own lives, the impending death that everyone is looking ahead to, and to think, is there anything that the Scripture can say, especially as I think about, not only the brevity of my own life, but my mortality and everything that attends dying. Well, before I get going, let me read to you, it's an older quote from a man named Joe Bailey, who himself has died, but now this is what he wrote before he did. He said, "In this day of scientific breakthrough and exploding knowledge, death especially frustrates us. An electroencephalogram may replace a mirror held to the mouth, autopsies may become more sophisticated, cosmetic embalming may take the place of pennies on the eyelids and canvas shrouds, but death continues to confront us with its black wall. Everything else seems to change. Death is changeless. We may postpone it, we may tame its violence, but death is still there waiting for us. Death always waits. The door of the hearse is never closed. Dairy farmer and sales executive live in death's shadow along with Nobel Prize winner and prostitute, mother, infant, teen, and old man. The hearse stands waiting for the surgeon who transplants a heart, as well as the hopeful recipient, for the funeral director, as well as the corpse he manipulates. Death spares no one." Yeah, those are sober words, and, it might be uncomfortable to hear this kind of stuff. Don't turn me off. I'm hoping that you bear with the discomfort, because if you face the discomfort of facing your own death, I think it becomes just a little easier. Denial of death does not make the ongoing years any easier. It's interesting. In our society, we talk about everything, and we're explicit about everything. Sex, money, relationships, failures. All of these things are now on public display, but it seems like death and God is very seldom spoken about. Now, you might say, well, that's not really true, because, every movie that's ever made, people getting killed all the time. Yeah, they are, but you never get the implication of death, the grieving that happens, the loss that happens in people's lives, the ongoing of years when people come to terms with death. That's seemingly just swept under the carpet. So let me say that, on the other hand, there are people who never think about death. I've met people in their 80s and even in their early 90s who say they've never thought about death at any time in their lives. I find that fascinating, because I need to say quite openly and frankly, I don't think that a day goes by that I don't think of my own death. In fact, if you think that's morose, let me quote to you from several people. Richard Baxter, English preacher in the 1600s, wrote these lines. He said, "I preached," he's talking about, his regular life as a preacher, "I preached as never sure to preach again, and as a dying man to dying men. I am the one who's dying in the pulpit, and I'm looking at the congregation, and I recognize they're all dying as well." That's how Baxter said he looked at himself and the role that God had given him. Or I love the resolutions of Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards, great clergyman, wrote one of his resolutions which said, "Resolve to think much on all occasions of my dying and of the common circumstances which attend death." As much as I can to think about dying and the circumstances that attend death. And if you know anything about Edwards' death when he finally came, it came very suddenly. And as suddenly as it came, Edwards seemed to be very relaxed about it and seemed to go through it with a deep sense of submission to the will of God. And I think that's possible for any one of us. Now, again, let me say, I know that when I speak this way, there are some people who are going to say this sounds overly morbid, and yet it sounds fascinating, doesn't it? And I'm talking today about facing the brevity of life. And this is a short series. I'm simply speaking for 5 different series events through facing trouble and finding God. I've spoken about from Psalm 73, I've spoken about the reality of injustice in the world, but I think the reality of our own death is the greatest trouble that any of us face. I'm basing my teaching today on Psalm 90. It's a very challenging psalm, and it tells us how to live in the shadow of death. It tells us how to pray. It tells us how to come to terms with our own sins. It tells us how to come to terms with God and His character, His righteousness. And it tells us how to ask God to favor us in the hour of our death. But more than anything else, I think there is a note of happiness that's here in this psalm, so please don't dismiss it in any way. Now, let's read. I'm only going to take us through the first 4 verses, so let's read Psalm 90, verses 1 to 4, and then we're going to quietly go over those 4 verses and take them very carefully and slowly. The psalm begins with simply a statement at the top which says, "A prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you're God. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night." Well, there's a lot more that follows, but those 4 verses are enough for us to consider what exactly is being said. Now, before we look at the details, let's step back and notice again that it begins with the words, "A prayer of Moses, the man of God." Now, you might not know this, but Moses was a number of things. He's of course the giver of the law. He's the great prophet of God. He's the leader of God's people. I mean, he's the man that stood to worldly powers and announced to Pharaoh that he had to let the people go. I mean, he's all these kind of things that we think about, great military leader. But he's also a poet, and he's also a songwriter. And we know that from Psalm 90, but we also know 2 other poems and songs that he's actually written. And the first one comes from Exodus chapter 15. And it's an interesting time when he delivered that. The people of Israel had been led through the wilderness, and they'd now come to the Red Sea. I mean, they had watched as, God had delivered 10 series of 10 plagues on the Egyptians, and they were brought out of the land of slavery. Moses was leading them through the wilderness, and Pharaoh and his army basically said, look, what have we done letting these slaves go? We're going to go back and fetch them. And so now the people of Israel are lined up against the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are bearing down with their elite charioteers, and everyone's panicked and in fear. And of course, God causes this great column of fire to come and separate Israel from Egypt. And then that night, a wind comes and blows a channel in which Israel walks through to the Red Sea. Finally, the charioteers follow, and God closes up the water and drowns them all. And they're standing on the far bank of the Red Sea, looking out and seeing the drowned charioteers, the elite of the Egyptian fighting forces. Moses writes a poem, of all things, and he has it put to music and has Israel sing the song. And it goes like this, and many of you have read this. It's in the beginning of Exodus chapter 15. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name." Now that poem, Moses writes about everything that God has done to deliver Israel. Now at that point in time, I need to say that Moses is still a very young man. And, sometimes when if you're walking after God faithfully, when you're a young man or a young woman, you might think about all of the mighty times that God intervenes into your life and brings you deliverance from all sorts of situations. And so you might be able to identify with Moses, at least at that point in time. And again, I say he's young. I know he was 80 years old at the time, but he still had another 40 years to go. So in that sense, he was young. Now, Moses did write another poem, but this poem was written at the end of his life. And this poem was written at a time when he had climbed up Mount Nebo, and he was allowed to see the promised land from afar. And he was told also that he would die not in the promised land, but on the other side. And so he wants to give a song to Israel that they might remember so that they would be faithful to God after his death. And that poem begins this way. Oh, give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. And speak he does. He tells of the mercy of God towards Israel. He recounts his own frustration and sadness because of the continuous rebelliousness among the people of God. And yet he's still filled with hope. He knows that there is no God besides the one true God. So we have that in Deuteronomy chapter 32. So we have a collection of Moses' poems, one at the beginning of his ministry, the other at the end of his life, and then we have this one here in Psalm 90. Now, there's no hint in terms of Psalm 90 that tells us exactly when Moses would have written this, and that's led to a great deal of speculation. I mean, one bit of speculation is that it might have been written shortly after the events of Numbers 13 and 14. Now, if you look that up, you'll learn a lot about what happened there. It's the event that happened at Kadesh Barnea. Moses sent spies into the promised land. They come back and they say, it's really a beautiful land, but the people are so powerful that we'll never be able to overtake them. We'll all be crushed by them. And so there's this massive, rebellion against Moses. And as a result of that, that Israel's going to wander now for 40 years in the wilderness. And over the next 40 years, Moses was to watch as 2 million people died in the desert. It's kind of like the world's longest funeral march. God says, listen, if you don't want to go into the promised land, I won't let you go into the promised land, but your children will go. You're going to live in this wilderness and die after 40 years. So, 2 million people died, which, basically means around 50,000 funerals every year, 100 every day. No wonder Moses thought about the brevity of life. He was witnessing death on a daily basis. And so some people say, it's really Numbers 13 and 14, and, that all of them were going to die in the wilderness. That kind of led the way to the writing of Psalm 90. And that might be right. We just don't know. Others suggest, well, maybe it happened after, the death of Miriam, Moses' sister. There's all sorts of, theories about when this might have written, but it really doesn't matter. Moses was a man who was familiar with death and with dying. He lived among dying people, and by the time he sins against God himself, when God says, you too won't enter the promised land, Moses knows that he's taking his place in this traveling caravan of death. He's going to join with them and die in this wilderness and not see the promised land. And so the poem kind of makes sense. It's about the brevity of life from a man who recognizes what the brevity of life looks like. Well, C.H. Leupold, who is a Lutheran scholar, wrote of this poem. He says, there does not appear to be any trace of bitterness in this poem, or of undue pessimism, he says. Just plain, realistic thinking mark these words. In other words, when we read Psalm 90, listen, we don't find Moses shaking his fist at death or even shaking his fist at God, saying, why do you allow me to die? Rather, we have Moses simply very, reasonably looking at death itself and coming to terms with the fact that life is amazingly short. And it is. Let me say this year on this planet, somewhere around 55 million people will die. We have 40 million people in Canada, so it's going to be larger than the population of Canada will die this year and every year. So that's interesting. That means that people all over this planet will mourn deeply the loss of a loved one. The cries of pain and the cries of anguish that rise up from this planet every single year. If we thought about it, I think it would kind of crush us. But death is the ever-present reality that we live with, and only when we close our eyes to its reality do we seem to ever be free of it. But it should be deafening to us. It is the story that should encompass our lives. So let's move quite slowly as we study the psalm, and let's notice several things. Now, verses 1 to 4 will teach us something about the human condition. And so let's begin and reread verse 1 all over again. Lord, Moses begins, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. So understand the context. Israel is in the wilderness. They're going to be wandering there for 40 years, and the generation that rebelled against God are all going to die there. They've left the Red Sea. They've traveled south. They have come after the Red Sea crossing to Mount Sinai. They spend a great deal of time there. They receive the 10 Commandments. They build a tabernacle, and they receive instructions as to how to worship God. And they receive also instructions on the duties of their priests. And what happens after that? Well, many of us don't understand what happened. According to Numbers chapter 33, in the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, Israel set up about 42 camps along the way. That is to say, in 40 years, they moved 42 times. Now, in truth, none of that would have happened if they hadn't sinned against God. Now, I know all of that. They had refused God's gracious offer to enter the promised land. They didn't think that God would come through for them. And so they were destined to wander in the wilderness, constantly moving. Now listen, if for 40 years you moved once every year, 40 times, or for the rest of your life you moved every year, what would you call home? Or to use the biblical language, what would you call your dwelling place? Well, the answer would be that'd be difficult to come by. I mean, how do you answer that question? And for those of you who are watching me now and you're thinking, well, I mean, actually, I've lived in the same place. I have a brother-in-law who took over my in-laws' farm, and my in-laws lived in that farm place for their lives. In fact, that piece of land has been in the family since the late 1800s, and my brother-in-law is now living in the house that he grew up in and has raised his own daughters in as well. So, if there's this sense, if you've never moved and you've always stayed in the same place, you can suffer from the illusion that, look, I mean, life seems stable. I mean, life seems planted. I'm always in the same place, the same, surroundings, the friendship networks that are there, the familiar landmarks. I mean, all of those things, can give us the sense of permanence in this world. But again, I say that's an illusion because, in fact, Israel, moving 40 years, understood that no place where they ever were belonged to them. The place that belonged to them lay in the future. They were, as the book of Hebrews tells us, journeying to an eternal city. And we're pilgrims that are moving towards an eternal city. Our home is heaven. Our home is in the future. Our home is not in this place. So look at what Moses said. Where is your dwelling place? Where's home? And Moses, who's moved 40 times in 40 years, answers, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. When I think of home and say, where is it that I ultimately belong? I belong in the presence of God. Let me say something about the brevity of life and this very concept. We need to come to terms with the fact that there is no place of belonging outside of the presence of God. Now, you get that into your soul. And you can deal with the other stuff. If you never get that into your soul, if the Lord never seems like your home, if home always is, something in this world, you're only going to be threatened with loss. But if the Lord is your home, there is no loss to come because nothing will be able to separate you from His presence. That first line, it's all about the brevity of life, but to start that way and say, my home, my dwelling place, the place where I belong, is in the presence of the God who made me and the God who has a future for me. When I think about where I belong and where I can feel stable, it's there. And I'm going to say to you, that's so important for all of us. You come to terms with that and bear that deeply in your soul, and you're going to feel differently about all of life, and you're going to feel differently about your own impending death. You see, here's the truth of it. Your job is not forever. Your situation in life is not forever. Your marriage is not forever. Your financial status is not forever. Your house is not forever. Your city is not forever. Any other thing that you can think about is not forever except for one thing, and that's God. My dwelling place, my home, the presence of God. Well, let's go to verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. I love that verse. I mean, Moses describes God as being everlasting. In other words, he says, you go to an endless place in the past. You keep on tracing back into eternal ages backward, and you will never find a time when God was not there. That's an incredible concept. And then he goes forward and says, now if you go into the future, whatever endless times, eternal ages roll by, there will never be a time or a place when God is not there. That one constant, when everything else is changing, is God. And that's, the book of Revelation will call God and Jesus, his son, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the only constant in an ever-changing world. And then we come to verse 3. You return, that is you, the everlasting God. You return man. See the contrast between the nature of God and our own nature? You, God, return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. That is, return to dust. Yeah, dust. The book of Genesis describes us as having been made in Genesis chapter 2 from the dust of the ground. Meaning that God assembled us from earthly elements, that is, our earthly body. And then, of course, the time comes when we return to dust again, and it's just a few short years. In other words, if you go back those eternal ages when God was there, you and I weren't there. And if you go forward not too far into the future, you and I stop being here on this earth. It's interesting, I was thinking about, as I was preparing this, a song that was written some time ago by Leonard Cohen, a Canadian songwriter and musician who's now passed away. And as far as I know, and best evidence that I have, Cohen never came to peace with God through Jesus. However, at times he had some keen insight about the nature of God and our own brevity of life. And in one of the songs that he wrote, and I just wrote it on the back here, it was called If It Be Your Will, and just listen to the words of someone who actually didn't know Christ. If it be your will, writes Cohen, that I speak no more, and my voice be still as it was before. And then he writes, I will speak no more. That's what's going to happen. I will abide until I am spoken for, if it be your will. In other words, it's all in the will of God. The beginning of my days, the end of my days, the ability that I have to speak, and the time will come when my voice is silenced and my mouth no longer moves. That's all in the hands of God. Here's what Moses is saying. I know that. You're the eternal one, I'm not. Isn't it fascinating how many people never come to terms with that very basic concept about what life is all about? I find it overwhelming that we're not constantly in a nation like this having these conversations. Soon this nation will be no more. My goodness, no nation survives forever, and this one won't either. And so whatever we talk about, Canadian values, the reality is we're talking temporal language. And whenever we're talking about God's law, we're talking about eternal values. Please know that. Please know that whatever pride that you have in life is a pride that lasts for a moment and then you are no more. The one who created you simply says, if it be my will, you will exist for this moment. And the minute I remove my will from your existence, you cease to be. You came from dust. You return to dust. You are vulnerable. It's who you are. Come to terms with that. Come to terms with that. And then we come, to verse 4, and that's the interesting one. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. Now, a lot of people have wondered why Moses uses the term 1,000 years or as a day. I mean, he could have said 1,000,000 years. I mean, he could have said 10 years. I mean, however he could have expressed himself, why 1,000? And some people suggest that it's 1,000 because, according to the biblical record which Moses himself gave us, the longest living man that we have on record lived 969 years. That guy was named Methuselah. I've often thought about a man who lives 969 years. And of course, in the days before the universal flood, individual lives were very, very long. I mean, I've thought about, if that, my own life, when I get to be 100, I'd say, man, I've hardly started. I'm basically in my teenage years. I mean, what would that be like? I mean, my goodness, to look at this, this hundreds and hundreds of years that would lie before Methuselah, and he would continue to live and make plans in this world. I mean, wouldn't he think that the dwelling place that he had was in this earth because he lived so long? And some of us might envy that deeply. Oh, I wish I had that kind of a lifespan, because as it is, my life seems to go by so quickly. See, and what would that be like? And yet, think of this. Methuselah himself, who lived almost 1,000 years, is not remembered for anything other than he lived 969 years. What he did, what he loved, what he hated, what he accomplished, where he went, when he succeeded, when he failed, that's all been swept away by the sands of time. It's like dust. It's no more. See, look at it again. 1,000 years. In verse 4, in your sight is but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. Watches in the night were typically about a 4-hour or a 3-hour watch in the night. I mean, yeah, it seemed significant when you were in the middle of it and trying to keep awake and staring into the darkness, of ancient cities looking for an enemy who might be lurking, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it seemed long, but when it was over, you said, man, that passed by quite quickly. And that is how our lives are as well. So it may seem like 1,000 years are a long time, but God looks at it and says, yeah, it's just as yesterday it has gone past. Now, we're going to continue with this more when we talk about this next time, but I want us to think about and go back to the words of Moses in verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. Now, look at those words, before the mountains were brought forth. I have here some notes from a sermon that was preached by Augustine, the great Christian preacher. Augustine thought that the expression before the mountains, that phrase, he said, contained a very particular meaning. He said that the mountains are the higher parts of the earth, and if God was before even the things that seem so formidable, that the phrase allows us to look beyond the mountains, beyond the things that are formidable, to look at God. Now, I think this might be what Moses might have thought. God is more formidable than the most formidable thing that I witness on this earth. And I might suggest that the thought of God is the most formidable thought that you have. You might be overwhelmed with death, and it might overwhelm you that your years are passing by so quickly. But let me say something that's far more formidable than the brevity of life, and it is the thought of God. That is the ultimate situation that lies before us. And that brings me back to verse 1. Lord, you have been my dwelling place. So imagine Moses again, no dwelling place, no place to call home. Once he had called Egypt home, and he was considered one of the royal sons there. Wealth and prestige were his, but his mother had taught him about God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and of Jacob, and somehow he preferred the God that his mother had taught him about, and the hope of a Messiah, and he preferred that to the treasures of Egypt, and so suddenly the life of Egypt, which offered him so much in this world, was gone from him. And then for a great period of time, for 40 years, he lives in a place called Midian, in a desert with nomadic people group, and he marries there, and he has children, and he's got all sorts of things, but he settles down, and he's found another place called home until that's disrupted from him. And then, of course, he goes back again to Egypt and delivers God's people. They end up at Mount Sinai, and they spend about 2 years there. And it seems for a while that's his home, in front of the mountain of God. And yet at another point in time, that's taken away from him as well. I'm trying to give you a picture of a man who seemed to be rooted at times in his life, who would have looked ahead and said, my future here is secure, and then it stops being secure. What seemed formidable, which seemed to have gravitas, if you will. It seemed like, this is where I belong and this is where my future lies. Suddenly all of that's yanked away. Finally he stands at Mount Nebo and looks at the promised land and sees he's not going to go over there and he's going to die there. But before all of that, before all of the adventures that Moses had, this constant deaths that he witnessed, every single year by year, all of this stuff, he constantly recognized that there was one significant thing. Before the mountains were brought forth, before the most significant things in my view of this world, the things that seemed largest and most imposing, ahead of all of those, the largest and most imposing thing is the idea of God. And I believe that my dwelling place, my place of belonging is there. I know that some of us, when we think of our own death, some of us, the only way we know how to deal with that is just not to think about it. Think about what we're doing today. Enjoy ourselves today. Death is coming, but, just keep it at bay from your own thinking. And in that way, we think we've dealt with it. But that's only temporary. The reality is, it will soon be all past. And there will be endless ages that go after us. And even though in all sorts of obituaries that you read in newspapers and all sorts of other places, people will say you're never forgotten. The reality is they're always forgotten. See, you have to ask yourself, where do you want home to be? If you say, I can't get my mind around the idea of God and that my home is in relationship to Him, then I fear for you, because you're in a vulnerable place. Everything that you think of value and significance is soon going to be taken from you, and you will have nothing. But if, on the other hand, you think about all of the things in this world as nothing, and think about God as the only significant factor in your life, you have everything. Nothing can take God from you. Eternal ages will roll by, but your life will be in God. See, this is a wonderful story about our salvation. God has sent His Son Jesus into the world, who has died for our sins and opened up the door of reconciliation with Him so that we might deal with Him and that He becomes the significant issue in our lives. Please don't pass this by. The reality is that I who speak to you am aware that it will soon be that my lips no longer speak and I will be gone. So will you. I speak as a dying man to dying men and women, and say to you, the only dwelling place that is worth our investment is the dwelling place of God, who created us, who sent His Son to redeem us, and invites us into eternal relationship with Him. Do not discount the offer. It is the greatest offer that has ever been given. Hey, thank you for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada today. Delighted that you spent the time in Psalm 90. Invite you to keep on joining me as we study through this fascinating psalm that gives us the skill of living in the presence of God. God bless you. Have a great day. Thank you for watching today, and I want to ask you to make sure that you hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel so that you can receive any further notifications of all the videos that we prepare for you. Thank you so much for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada.